research at Johns Hopkins University had developed a new protocol for chemotherapy for her cancer, a protocol that was not available in 1975. Without that research, Debbie and I would not have celebrated our 46th wedding anniversary last June. Through the sale of the End Breast Cancer Specialty License Plate, the Florida Breast Cancer Foundation is able to provide significant grants to research centers in Florida to help fight and end breast cancer. The cost for a specialty plate is just $30 a year more than for a regular Florida license plate. But every time you purchase or renew that plate, you help fund more research and you help save lives just like Debbie's. We have one for each of our cars, and I hope that you will take the time to get one for your car if you don't already have it. A certificate for the reimbursement of the $30 for a first-year plate holder of the End Breast Cancer license plate is in your bag. If you already have the license plate for your car, pass the certificate to someone who would consider purchasing the plate. If you do not already have the plate, the certificate will help defray the first-year cost of the plate for a new plate holder. Help us fund more research by purchasing the End Breast Cancer license plate. Now, to introduce our next speaker, I'm proud to call on our founder and current vice chair of our board, Jayne Torres.
Good morning. It's really a pleasure to see you all and to be here with you and to introduce Dr. Michael Antoni. You know, 20 years ago when I was diagnosed with breast cancer, I was determined to do everything possible to increase my chances of having a very long and healthy life. So one of the things I did was to enroll in a stress management program. And what we did was learn stress management techniques, we practiced relaxation, and we got to spit into vials. And the reason we were spitting into vials, we did it before a relaxation exercise and then after a relaxation exercise. And what they did was measure the amount of cortisol before and after. Now, cortisol is a steroid hormone which is released in response to stress and which suppresses the immune system. I didn't know Dr. Antoni at that point, but I soon learned that he was one of the foremost, and is one of the foremost researchers on the effect of stress management and disease. At the same time that I was diagnosed and I was going through the stress management training, I also thought to myself, you know, what's the best thing I can do for myself, for my daughter, and for all men and women in terms of breast cancer reduction or avoidance? And I think that research is probably one of the best things to help us all now and in the future. So we founded the Florida Breast Cancer Foundation with the mission of reducing breast cancer or ending the breast cancer epidemic through advocacy, education, and research. One of the things we did in 2002 was to get the End Breast Cancer license plate approved by the Florida legislature. Since 2002, from the sale of the license plate, we have earned about $6 million, and we have awarded more than $4 million to people like Dr. Antoni for breast cancer research. Dr. Michael Antoni is a Sylvester Distinguished Professor of Psychology and Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at the University of Miami. He is co-program leader of the Cancer Prevention, Control, and Survivorship Multidisciplinary Research Program at the Sylvester Cancer Center. He's a licensed psychologist in the state of Florida, and he plays a mean keyboard with a rock and roll band called Guilty Pleasure. So check it out. Over the past 3 decades, Dr. Antoni has authored and co-authored many publications on the effect of stress factors, social resources, and stress management interventions on psychological adaptation, biological processes, and clinical health outcomes in diseases such as breast cancer, prostate cancer, and in women at risk for cervical cancer. I am extremely pleased to tell you that the Florida Breast Cancer Foundation awarded Dr. Antoni a grant last year to test the effects of novel, briefer 5-week forms of stress management on positive and negative mood. We were able to make this important contribution to understanding the effect of stress management on the quality of life, recurrence, and survivorship of men and women with breast cancer because of contributions from our supporters like you, and for those of you who have purchased the End Breast Cancer Plate, thank you. We get $25 from each plate when it is purchased, as well as when it is renewed. And so if you haven't already, use the coupon in your bag and tell your friends. That's one of the best ways to help fund research. So please help me in welcoming Dr. Michael Antoni. And he'll do a little performance too, right?
Thank you, Jane, and thank you especially to the Florida Breast Cancer Foundation for our recent grant that began last June. And this is the most important slide I can show. This is the acknowledgments for all the people that have been involved in the research that I'll present today that represents 3 decades of work in breast cancer. And the most recent one you see there with the asterisks is the Florida Breast Cancer Foundation funding an award this summer. At the Sylvester Cancer Center, we have a program called CPCS, or Cancer Prevention, Control, and Survivorship, that addresses cancer along the continuum, and our major goal is to develop behavioral interventions to improve either the risk of cancer, the screening for cancer, or the course of cancer. The work that I'll focus on today is behavioral and psychological interventions to improve what I'll call adaptation, or how people manage going through cancer treatment and into survivorship. This is part of a body of research that's been going on now for a number of years called Biobehavioral Oncology. A very good description of that is in this journal, Brain Behavior and Immunity, in 2013. The notion is, can we take evidence from animal and human research that stress factors or biobehavioral factors can affect the brain in ways that the brain can signal peripheral chemicals like cortisol, like adrenaline, that can then interact with immune cells and cancer cells to ultimately affect the course of the cancer. If we can prove that or have strong evidence for that, we try to bottle up interventions that try to improve the psychological and behavioral factors such that processes such as inflammation, invasion, metastasis might be mitigated. And that ultimately our goal is for that to move into cancer clinical care. Well, focusing today on the work in breast cancer is a leading cancer in the United States. Women, 14% of cancer-related deaths are breast cancer. And there is, however, with this reduced mortality, a large survivorship population that needs to find ways to develop lifestyle changes to optimize the rest of their lives. And a third of the improved survival that we now see in breast cancer is believed to be attributed to teams of clinicians working together on both behavioral and biomedical interventions to improve the course. Psychosocial interventions are part of multidisciplinary care, and it's clear that they offer benefits in terms of quality of life. But can they also be used, we wondered, as experimental probes to actually modulate psychological adaptation in order to change biological processes that might be relevant for clinical outcomes? What's the rationale? What's the theory behind that? And what is the evidence? I hope to get to some of those things today. I'm going to use as a case study 3 decades of research in something called cognitive behavioral stress management, which is what Jayne spoke about. I'll try to teach you some of the techniques that are involved there, some of the readout systems that we look at to see how good we're doing in terms of improving psychological and physiologic adaptation, and then talk about some exciting work that the Florida Breast Cancer Foundation is funding now to actually look at molecular changes in cells that happen as women go through these kinds of interventions. The rationale for stress management. I probably don't have to sell you on this, but breast cancer is a stressor. There are challenges of the diagnosis, the surgery, and the adjuvant treatments. However, not everyone does as well with it as others, and we've identified some patient assets, or things, if you take these on the journey with you, they may facilitate adaptation. We then, after years of observing how some women did better than others with going through breast cancer treatment, we developed a stress management package that initially was 10 weeks long. Recently, we tried to test it in a 5-week version. The stress management, the theory there is if we can improve psychological adaptation, we should be able to improve physiologic adaptation, and over the long haul, 10, 15 years, we might see improvements in health outcomes. This all started with work. I joined a team with Dr. Charles Carver at the University of Miami in the late 80s, and they were observing what's it like going through treatment for breast cancer from the point of surgery across that first year. So they did interviews and psychological assessments 2 to 8 weeks after surgery, 3 months, 6 months, and 12-month follow-up. They ask questions like, gee, what are the things that are on women's minds? What are their biggest concerns as they start moving through treatment? Many of them mentioned that their life goals were threatened. There was a major speed bump in their career plans. Their self-image as a woman, as a partner, was being questioned. And they were afraid of the physical side effects of adjuvant treatment on quality of life. One woman mentioned, I don't know if they'll be able to put Humpty Dumpty back together again once they start treatment. Then we asked, what are the kinds of things that could help women with those concerns? Are there characteristics that describe women who might do better than others going through treatment? And we did a longitudinal study where we looked at pre-surgical acceptance, coping, and optimism. And lo and behold, we found that the more women were using that up to surgery, the better they did. They had less distress 3 months after surgery. The less distress they had after surgery, the less they were practicing maladaptive coping styles like denial and disengagement. And the more they were practicing those disengagement strategies, the more distress they had. So you can see a cycle here where distress begets poor coping, which begets more distress, and on and on. We also noticed when we asked women about their social support networks that greater social support pre and post-surgery predicts less distress in the months after. Spousal support was important, particularly after surgery when the women came home, but support from other women in their networks, either in their family or in their friendships, was important in the months that followed. So we learned a few things by stepping back, observing, and applying our statistics that there were certain concerns people had, that optimism, active coping, and social support seemed to help them adjust psychologically as they moved through. So the next question was, can we form an intervention, a group-based intervention that had social support built into it, that could teach specific coping skills that might be associated with an optimistic outlook, that might be associated with better coping strategies. And that's what I'm going to describe now. The model for this intervention is in our book by the American Psychological Association. The abbreviation you'll hear me use over and over again today is CBSM, Cognitive Behavioral Stress Management. These are the goals of an intervention like this. We want to increase people's awareness. Where is stress? How do they feel it? How do they know they have a cue to do something different? We teach them to change the way they think about stress, cognitive appraisals. We teach them ways to express their emotions and process their emotions. And then discrete techniques like relaxation of the muscles, breathing, imagery, etc. The idea is to decrease physiological arousal, tenseness, anxiety, and also to build social support. How would you attack this? Well, usually when psychologists try to form an intervention that they're going to put in a clinical trial, they have to have aims, strategies, and techniques. The aims I just described. The strategies would be what we actually planned to achieve with the women on a relative short-term basis. And then the techniques were, what are the things on the shelf of clinical psychology that's already available that we can plug in to achieve some of these things? So over on the right side, we used didactic and written information, self-monitoring exercises. People would go home, monitor their sources of stress, learn about their reactions to stress, try changing the stress with some experiments, and then reporting back to the group. PMR is progressive muscle relaxation. It's part of a set of relaxation techniques that we taught. Cognitive restructuring is that actual ability to shift the way you think about a stressor. Coping skills training is what you do behaviorally. Do you actively cope? Do you reframe situations, or do you avoid, deny, withdraw? These are your behaviors. And then finally, we tried to raise people's awareness of their social support network. They would draw little maps of their social network and then identify, gee, who are the ones that are good at emotional support versus the ones you wouldn't dare want to get emotional support from, but they're good for a ride or are good for some advice. So we put this into training manuals, and you can see on the left there's a training manual that master's level and PhD level clinical psychologists used as sort of a recipe book. And over on the right is a participant workbook where the patients had homework assignments they would do each week. The book in the middle is the empirical evidence. As I mentioned, the CBSM intervention had two major components: relaxation. This would be in the first 45 minutes of every weekly session. They would either be relaxing their muscles, thinking about pleasant images. Autogenic training was methods for making the blood shunt to the exterior of the body, which is consonant with relaxation. Mindfulness meditation, being very aware of the moment, and then a lot of deep breathing exercises. So relaxation therapy, everybody has different cartoons of what they think relaxation therapy is. Some people think it's imaging Miami Beach on a better day than today, and all of the sounds and the scents and the rhythms of being in a beach environment. Other people want to focus on the mechanics of breathing. So we talk about diaphragmatic breathing, how an opera singer learns to breathe from down low as opposed to up high. And that is something that can also trigger a change in the sympathetic nervous system such that you are more relaxed simply by shifting the position of your breathing. So deep breathing exercises were taught. In addition to the body work of the breathing, the muscles, we also did head work, which was called cognitive behavior therapy. We taught people about the links between their thoughts, their feelings, and their behaviors. And the components of that are raising awareness. Where do I hold my stress? In my trapezius muscles, in my emotions, in my thinking, in my social withdrawal or social neediness and clinging. How do I know I'm under stress? What is my coping repertoire? What do I do? Where's my favorite strategy to go to? Is it direct or indirect? What about the link between these thoughts and emotions? We would teach people exercises to say, get aware of how you're feeling. You're feeling guilty, anxious, depressed, angry, joyous, affectionate, sensuous, etc. What are the thoughts that are going with those feelings? Trying to make that link for people. And then we teach people about the social support resources in their environment. Who's good at emotional versus who's good at instrumental? What's the best situation for each? So in the booklets, there were exercises so people could find out, where do I hold my stress? What does it mean for me to hold my stress cognitively, behaviorally, etc.? We would talk about the mind-body linkage, that the way you think can affect your mood, and that can be correlated with cortisol levels and physiologic status and behaviors. So we went through exercises. People would bring in the stressor of the week, whether it was about their family, their doctor, something that was going on at work. We'd talk about their appraisals and thoughts, and then show them the correlation between those processes and outcomes like mood and physical state. We talked about how people cope. Some people tend to use avoidance strategies where they either run away from stressors or tune out of stressors. We talked about passive emotion-focused strategies like drinking, appetitive behaviors, overeating, eating poor food, and people just learned their repertoire, what's in their toolbox currently, and then we would teach new techniques. We would move through processes that people go through when they're exposed to stress. You're thinking about your follow-up mammogram. I might have a recurrence. This triggers an anxious thought. Anxious thoughts trigger physiologic changes, heart races. You're aware of your heart racing in your neck, and you become more anxious. And so we taught people about these vicious circles that get created between your thoughts and your physiology and your mood, and how people can get stuck in that. It's a very empowering thing to show a person that, because then you could say, we actually can cut right through that with changing the thoughts you're having right now. We talked about coping. When you think about coping, some people think about, well, just getting through it, but you can actually actively cope and change the course of things, but it's wise to have a good energy management strategy with coping. If you consistently try to cope actively with things that are out of your control, you're going to constantly hit a wall, and you're going to run out of energy. If you can allocate those coping resources to things that are controllable, so it's sort of smart coping, if you will. And so we taught people with Hurricane Andrew or another hurricane as an example, separate the world into the controllable from the uncontrollable, apply what's called problem-focused strategies to the controllable, and emotion-focused strategies to the uncontrollable. What's an emotion-focused strategy? Using relaxation to cool off your engine. It's your radiator, essentially. You can't change a situation, but you might be able to improve the way you feel. Then we gave them an example of breast cancer, and we had lively discussions that no one ever agreed fully on what was controllable and what was uncontrollable, but the exercise of being able to have the license to go through your world and separate it into controllable and uncontrollable parts. And so, again, the general algorithm was, for the controllable things you identify, apply problem-focused, for uncontrollable, emotion-focused. We then taught techniques to learn how to ask for social support. Not everyone comes from a family or a background where they know how to ask for help. And a lot of people try to brave it and cowboy up or cowgirl up when they go through tough situations. And so we wanted to teach strategies that were useful for asking for help from the social network, being assertive about getting your needs met. And then we also taught anger management so people could find a sweet spot between stuffing anger and major nuclear explosion anger. So is there a place in the middle where you can express your anger in a healthy way, then ask for help with assertiveness? So if you were a graduate of this program, you would know that when you go through stress and have automatic thoughts about stress, you can feel them in your cognitions, your emotions, behaviors, physical or social self. Then when you look at your thoughts, if your thoughts are distorted, you see unrational thoughts in the way you describe yourself. You're using the word never, ought to, should, always happens like this. Those are cues for you to use something called cognitive restructuring, where you find a more reasonable interpretation. But not everybody distorts every thought they had. That would be a mess. A lot of people have undistorted thoughts, and it's time to have a behavior. So that's the time to move to a coping strategy. Decide is the stressor uncontrollable, controllable, and here's a little list of some of the things that fall under emotion-focused and problem-focused strategies. Up on the top, we see that the trio of identifying where social support is in your world, managing your anger and mood, and then applying your assertiveness strategy to get the social support can all be important in affecting the stress response. So a graduate of the program is aware. They know about appraisals. They know about appraisals of controllability and uncontrollability. and they know what they have in their coping box, their toolbox. And finally, they understand what's in their social support environment, who's good for instrumental, who's good for emotional. If you were in one of these groups, you would meet for 10 weeks. The groups would last about 2 hours, as Jayne can attest to. We would present a technique, a new tool for the week, have a group discussion, do some role plays, try to apply it to real life situations, assign homework, which would involve going back into your world, relaxing every day with either, back then, a cassette tape that moved on to an MP3, which is what we use now, and then report back on success with identifying sources of stress. Well, hopefully you know a little bit about what the hell CBSM means now. What does the research tell us? Well, our model was that CBSM would not only improve adaptation, and negative adaptation you can think of as depression or negative mood. We hope to decrease that. But we also hope to increase positive mood, quality of life, appreciation of life. So we had measurements of all these things. We hypothesized that if we could change those, the blue arrow going down, that might affect endocrines or hormones such as cortisol and immune status, and ultimately that could improve longer-term physical health and quality of life. The study you'll hear about today first is the model for how we test our interventions. We focus on the first year of treatment. We recruit women up to about 8 or 10 weeks after surgery, but before they've started any adjuvant therapy, because we want to get a baseline biological and psychological measurement before they start chemo or radiation. We then assign them to either the stress management group. Back in these days, we nicknamed it B-SMART, and that was breast cancer, stress management, and relaxation training. Pretty corny, but easier to remember than CBSM, actually. So they either got the B-SMART condition or they got a control group that I'll describe. We took measurements at each of these points. If you were in that group, it was 45 minutes of relaxation each week, then about 90 minutes of CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, with a break in between. These are all the things we just talked about. The control group typically met on a Saturday in the middle of the 10-week program, and they got exposed mainly to breast cancer health education, but also learned about the existence of stress management techniques, but they didn't practice them over a 10-week period. They didn't have a regular group to go. It was like a self-help weekend seminar is what it was like. The trial, this is how we describe our trial. Sorry about the fonts are so small for some of you. Feel free to move closer, there's a lot of seats. This was one of the trials. We approached 403 women, 199 met the entry criteria. We assigned them to the control group on the left or the intervention group on the right. The experimental group, which is CBSM, showed reductions in negative mood, less thought intrusions. Thought intrusions are, how often are you thinking about breast cancer? How often is it popping into your head when you don't even want to think about it, daydreaming, etc.? Those things went down in the intervention, and it held at time 3, which is 12 months. We got reductions in anxiety, and we got reductions in social disruption. Women were starting to go back to their social groups, going to the movies, going to the theater, getting out. And that was what this was a measure of. We also saw reductions in sleep problems and fatigue in the women in the groups in red. And finally, on the upside, we saw that the women in our stress management group showed increases in positive states of mind, tranquility, positive mood, benefit finding, a sense that running through the gauntlet had made them stronger in some way, made them not sweat the small stuff, put life in perspective. And they also reported positive lifestyle changes in diet, exercise, and the like. We did what's called a mediation analysis where we said, well, what happened inside those groups that could have produced all these changes? So we used a measure called the measure of current stars, very boring name, but what it does is it tries to tap all the skills that we were targeting. And we also gave another measure called the EAC, Emotion Approach Coping Scale, that measures how much are you focusing on and looking at your emotions each week and expressing them to someone. So how often are you processing your emotions? The MOX, the first scale that measures all the skill sets, out of that scale, the most potent change over time was in items 1 and 10, which was as women moved through the groups, they felt more and more confident that they could use relaxation on demand whenever they needed it, whether they were at an appointment for a physician, in traffic, etc. So we saw, as you'd expect, the experimental group showed an increase in this confidence in using relaxation, and it held at 12 months. And they also reported focusing on their emotions more. Although that receded a little bit after the first 6 months, it was still superior to the control group over time. So we had these two components: confidence in using a skill and spending time focusing on and processing emotions. And so then, this is too many numbers that you care about, but when I present this at scientific conferences, they want to know, the first number is, does the CBSM group differ from the control group on all of these outcomes? And every time you see a star, that means yes, it was significantly different in terms of the movement over time. But when you enter into the equation information about how much relaxation skills did they report and how much emotional processing, that explains all of the difference between the two groups, such that it's no longer, the groups no longer look different. So if you can parse out what's called a mediator, the active ingredient of those groups, you can explain just about everything that happens psychologically. So up to this point, CBSM had effects on negative and positive adaptation. It appears to work through building confidence in behavioral skills like relaxation and emotional processing. It supports the notion that CBSM that delivers skills and emotional processing is important. But did it have effects on physiology? And so we move into the studies we started to do in the late 90s, where, and this is a model that shows the state of the literature that gives a good justification for why we look at cortisol. In most of the literature in psycho-oncology, people have shown that exposure to external events and the way we react to them, whether we manifest optimism on the one hand or depression on the other, can actually have effect on the brain and the signaling to the adrenal gland. The signaling to the adrenal gland can produce hormones such as cortisol and adrenaline, which can then affect tissue. It can actually affect the immune system and cancer processes. So the brain processes stress. It produces cortisol. And here's another cartoon for that. As Jayne mentioned, cortisol is a steroid. It's part of the system of responding to stress. Why did we think it would have an effect? The long and the short of it is, because relaxation works on anxiety, anxiety is related to cortisol, we should see reductions in cortisol in people who practice relaxation. Since cognitive behavioral therapy affects mood, especially depression, and since depression is related to cortisol, we should see reductions in cortisol from that. Cortisol is important for immune cells, as I'll point out in a minute. This is just to remind you of the trial. We have assigned people to CBSM or control. They start adjuvant therapy, CBSM ends, and they typically end adjuvant therapy, and then we start measuring blood samples and saliva samples over time. Here you can see that the people in the black-colored histograms on the left, the people in the stress management group showed a reduction in circulating cortisol in the evening compared to the controls in gray, and that tracks well with their relaxation that's on the other side. So as they're learning to relax, cortisol seems to be going down. If you look at that in a time lag fashion, it seems like relaxation and learning to reappraise or use mental gymnastics with stress in the first 6 months of the intervention predicts how well they're able to continually suppress cortisol production out to 12 months. And that's all that shows. What about the immune system? Prior work has shown that psychological interventions can affect the functioning of T lymphocytes. The functioning of T lymphocytes has been shown to predict disease recurrence, so it's an important target. So we wanted to measure how well the women's T cells were receiving information and then how well they were cloning in culture when we put them in a dish. And that's what happens in a good lymph node. A lymph node has a T cell that's communicating with another cell, and if everything connects, it makes an army of warriors that go to the site of an infection. and it ultimately produces these babies, these little T cells that come out. And so a way to capture that experimentally, take the women's blood samples at the same time of day, always 5 to 6 p.m., challenge them with something that hits a receptor that makes them clone, and then measure the radiation release, which tells you how many new babies are made by the lymphocytes. And so what we found was the women who were in the CBSM group showed a marked increase in this T cell function. Then we wanted to look at, well, what's going on chemically when that happens? Are they making those good cytokines? So we looked at something called interferon gamma, which is very important for protecting against viral infections. Women in stress management showed increases in gamma interferon that persisted out to 12 months compared to controls. So up to this point, we had evidence that the intervention affect physiologic adaptation and psychological adaptation. You could reasonably ask, though, is this really matter for cancer progression? Increased T cell function may help ward off viral infections, but other biological changes may be more relevant to the course of cancer. And these are the ones we've been pursuing over the last few years. We're particularly interested in these MMP9s down on the bottom. These are the enzymes that allow a tumor to pierce the blood supply, get in the blood supply, and begin to metastasize. If we could see changes in those kinds of enzymes and the genes that are used to express them, that might be important. Inflammation is also very important for cancer progression, and NF-kappa B is one of the chief signalers of inflammation. So we've been tracking these kinds of things. I'm going to fast forward because I'm getting some signals that we're running late, but the idea is, in an area called social genomics that we're in right now, investigators are looking at the link between stress and how people's gene expression, how much their genes are chirping, whether that actually changes when you're under stress to move you to an inflammatory state, to move you toward a state where you're protecting your body against inflammation. Why would that be important? Because if a saber-toothed tiger bites you, the main thing you have to worry about is that you won't get a bacterial infection, so the body goes into inflammation. It's an old prehistoric response, but it also pops up when you're under real-life stress on the right. And so people who are under stress tend to have gene expression that favors inflammation. And so we wanted to know if stress is related to biobehavioral mediators such as cortisol and inflammation. And these slides are pretty complex, but the cartoon here is what we're doing right now is looking at whether stress is related to the DNA transcription. That's the beginning part of gene observations of the world. And then we're also looking at whether those genes transcribe and then translate into actual peptides or proteins like CRP, C-reactive protein, interleukin-6, interleukin-1 that are in your bloodstream that can signal immune cells and signal cancer cells in a very negative way. So we're tracking all of those levels from transcription to translation to actual serum levels of these peptides. I'm going to show you a slide that I don't want to leave without showing you, because the methods here are probably not that important to you. We know that the more depressed mood the women bring to us after surgery, the more expression of 177 different genes they show. And these are some of the genes that they show upregulation for. We think this one is very important. This is the one that has to do with the cancer cell's ability to get into the bloodstream, travel, and recolonize as a metastasis. So we're very interested in MMP9, for instance. We found, long and short of it, the more depressed they were, the more upregulation of those genes. Fascinating, at MD Anderson, only the same year we published this, we found, Lorenzo Cohen found that in metastatic renal cell carcinoma patients, look at all the overlap of the genes that they found related to depression in their people. So on the left are our breast cancer patients. On the right are Lorenzo Cohen's renal patients. And so that gives a little more evidence. When we look at the serum concentration, how many of the proteins are being made and going out into the bloodstream, the depressed women had far more levels, higher levels of interleukin-1 beta, interleukin-6, and TNF-alpha, all inflammatory cytokines. And that was a decent correlation. Final thing that I don't want you to leave without seeing is we asked the question, did the women who got the stress management differ than the controls in their gene expression over time? That's what why we did the study in the first place. Importantly, when you look at the women, you have to take my word for it, there were no differences in age, type of surgery, extent of disease in those in the control group and those in the CBSM. And then we looked at whether or not they differed in their gene array. So I'm going to go off the mic for a second, but each column here is a woman. So this is woman number 1, woman number 2, that were assigned to the control group. These were the first 13 people we put through the trial, and then these are the people in stress management. And these genes up here are the ones associated with good immune functioning, antiviral immune function, things that protect you from viral infections. Down here, these are the inflammatory genes. You might say, not very interesting. All of them look about the same. What happened when they started to go through stress management, though? What happened 6 months later? You start to see a shift. You start to see that the women in the control group were showing a green color. That means their genes were going down. They were down-regulated for producing the good immune types of reactions. The CBSM group didn't change that much. The control group also was showing inflammation. They were showing increased gene signaling for inflammation. Red is hot, green is cool. The genes, and it's called a heat map, actually, in genetic research. And so what happened by 12 months, it started to crystallize a little more. You had the control group showing poor immune functioning against viruses and lots of inflammation compared to a very different pattern for inflammation in the CBSM group. So we're excited about those findings. Again, the same genes that were upregulated with negative mood were the ones that CBSM was bringing down. It was cooling them down, making them go green, if you will. So that's exciting. We have data in our papers if you're interested on all of those genes. And I want to end with talking about the Florida Breast Cancer Foundation. So I'm going to fast forward to that because I really appreciate that. Let's see if I can move this. Okay. That was all a 10-week intervention. Subsequent to that, we have begun to look at a 5-week intervention. Why? Because the women who came to half of those sessions did just as well as the ones who came to 8 to 10 of the sessions. So because of that, we formed a new intervention that, I think this is it, yeah. Just give me a couple more minutes and I'll get through this. We formed a new intervention trial. It's just finished its 12-month visit, and now we're going out to 7-year follow-up of these women. They could get either 5 weeks of cognitive behavior therapy, 5 weeks of relaxation, or 5 weeks of health education. How did we do that? We took the 10-week intervention, we shrunk it into a 5-week version of relaxation, a 5-week version of cognitive behavior therapy, and they're all groups, and a 5-week version of health education about breast cancer. We compared the 3 groups over time in 184 women, and I want to give you the update right now. The trial is done. Everyone's reached their 12-month follow-up, and so you have about 50-odd patients in each group. I wrote to the Florida Breast Cancer Foundation and said, you know, we have evidence that the women who are the most stressed out when they start might be the ones we really need to look at in detail with molecular analyses. Are you interested in it? So for that study, we are looking at these kinds of outcomes, psychological status, inflammation, and the same things we've been looking at. We are seeing that they are showing reductions in depression, intrusive thoughts, getting their social lives in order, and better quality of life. As predicted, the relaxation group is learning to relax the best, and the cognitive behavior group is learning to do other things better. The Florida Breast Cancer Foundation grant, funded in summer of 2014, draws the most distressed 51 women out of the sample. They have the most intrusive thoughts about breast cancer every day. It's on their mind constantly. We took those women across the 3 different conditions and did And this is just to prove to you that when we looked at those 51 women, they were beautifully balanced across the three conditions, no differences in biological status or psychological status at baseline. And this is the analysis that the Florida Breast Cancer Foundation is allowing us to do. They're allowing us to look at transcription of something called NF-kappa B, which has never been done before in a stress management study. You've probably seen these things that are called gel shifts, when you actually want to know if DNA is binding to make a protein. And this is the baseline, and this is the 12-month follow-up. We're doing this on every woman in the study, and we want to see that this inflammatory marker is going silent. We're looking for it to be present at baseline and disappearing afterwards. This is just a sample of the first few cases we've run in the different conditions. I'm blinded to whether they were in a control group or not. But that's the progress we're on. We've got about 15 done so far. The next thing we're doing is, you saw a microarray analysis here. We pulled out the genes that were showing the biggest bump from the stress management, the ones that were getting the greenest over time. And we're doing an analysis called qPCR polymerase chain reaction. It's a much more sensitive probe for those types of gene expressions. So ultimately, in the Florida Breast Cancer Foundation grant, we're doing DNA binding activity, the first one, then gene expression changes. We're also looking at the health of the cells that the women have circulating. How are their B cells doing at making antibodies whenever they need to? And how are their monocytes or myeloid cells doing at functioning? So we take their cells, like you saw earlier, PBMC, peripheral blood mononuclear cells, we challenge them. 48 hours later, we look at how well the immune system's functioning. So this is a combination menu of looking at sort of the master signaling, transcriptional signaling for inflammation. Does it actually go down over time in these women? And secondly, is their immune system getting more peppy, the good immunity? And so when we're done with this, the women are being followed at 7 years, and we're going to keep following them out to 15 years. Our position is that we take women from all these trials and we follow them into the Florida Breast Cancer Registry, the tumor registry, for survival. We look at recurrence in the medical charts over time. And in the 10-week study, I can say we're right in the middle now of publishing some evidence that the women who went through the 10-week intervention showed longer survival than the women who went in the control group. That's yet to be published, so take it with a grain of salt for right now. We are also seeing that the more their inflammatory gene signaling went down in that first year, the more days they lived, out to 15 years in the Florida registry. So that's an exciting way to link psychoneuroimmunologic changes with actual health outcomes. We are delivering the intervention in the community. Another trial is looking at African American women. The intervention is being delivered in churches and community centers in Overtown and Liberty City. This trial just finished. It's called Project Care. Got good coverage in the Herald a couple of months ago. Really made a difference in these women's lives. These are African American breast cancer survivors. We have another trial that's delivering a DVD with relaxation training in Spanish to Latinas who are going through chemotherapy. So integrated with their chemotherapy infusion sessions is access to these DVDs for relaxation. And finally, we're moving into remote technologies. We use conference calls to deliver the stress management to people who are homebound or don't want to deal with Miami traffic, or for one reason or another can't come to us. And there's a big movement right now for us to develop remote technologies to be able to deliver groups. So this one was delivered over a phone. They would get menus. They could review the sessions. Now we then went to video phones where people can actually see all their group members and their therapists without leaving their kitchen. And these groups involve people from all over the United States that are meeting together. They go to their neighborhood kiosk, LabCorp, to give their blood sample and their salivas. Those are shipped to us. So we can still do the PNI, the psychoneuroimmunology research, but we got a lot more reach to be able to do it. And so if you're in one of these groups, not only would you get that weekly connection with everybody in the group, but you get to play back videos of how to do that relaxation the right way, how to do the breathing and the imagery. So we're excited about using these technologies, moving from teleconferencing, video phones, and our newest trial is using iPads, where the people can tune into their group once a week, play back their videos, and we'll see if we still get enough of a punch with a distal group. They're not live in front of each other, but it's maybe the next best thing because everyone can visualize each other. And we'll see if we get 70–80% of the biological effect that we got with the live groups. And that's the way we can use technology. I think if I'm going to use a musical imagery to end my talk today, when we were in the 70s and 80s, everybody in psycho-oncology research was saying, well, stress management might affect quality of life. In the 90s, we came up with this term adaptation. They might actually adapt physiologically and psychologically better. In the 2000s, we started to show evidence that we could have effects on neuroendocrines and immune indicators, but we didn't know how long those would last. And now we're in the era where we're able to look at molecular changes in gene expression that might lock in an effect for an even longer time. And we're excited to see when we bring the women back who are in the Florida Breast Cancer Foundation study for their 7-year follow-up. We are measuring blood and saliva, and we want to see if the gene changes that happened early on lock in. My ending statement is I believe combining mechanism research with clinical efficacy research is efficient. Using microarray and bioinformatics technology, we can actually see the footprints left over by stress management on gene expression. And these changes portend the improved ability to respond to stress and optimize quality of life across the cancer continuum. By combining biotechnology with telecommunication technology, we can drill down to the mechanisms and reach out to the largest number of people in the population. Again, thank you for the funding you've received, along with all of this other funding over the years. I appreciate you letting me go a little over. Thanks. Sure. It's easier down here, I think.
In the African American community, there is a myth that therapy means you're crazy.
Is what?
Means you're crazy.
It means you're crazy.
Right.
You know, in the African American community, therapy is not what is taught.
Right.
Okay?
It's human-centered.
I believe in therapy.
Oh.
Okay? So when I was diagnosed with breast cancer, I already had therapists. So I'm fortunate in that area. But being a part of Sisters Network, I need to know what is a good way or professional way, or not the way I'm saying it, definitely not the way I'm saying it, to instrument that the ladies need some type of therapy. We have 1 or 2 ladies who've done Project Care, so we're familiar with Project Care. But if I see someone who needs therapy, how do I say it in a professional way, or in a way that's not offense to them?
Right.
You get what I'm
Yeah, so before Project Care could be done, we had to do focus groups with African American women and leaders in the community. And they set us straight on a few things. They said, all this CBT is wonderful, but what about the women who feel that they would prefer to cope through using religion or their beliefs? Is this going to clash with that? So we brainstormed together with them and came up with the idea that if we use something along the lines of the 12-step system that's used, where you learn what's controllable in the world and what's uncontrollable, and then apply the techniques you learn, we're able to deliver it in a less academic way and a more heartfelt way that was in tune with what people were already experienced at hearing or could accept more. The other thing we heard about with regard to religion is they said, well, you could actually quote Bible verses in the groups, and you could remind people that God helps those who help themselves. And that's how we actually taught people active coping strategies, was the notion of God helps those who help themselves. We also spent a lot of time on identifying spiritual and religious sources of support when we went over our social support sections. We could not have done that without focus groups. A lot of people who do the biological research don't take the time to go into the community, partner, and find out the way to make the interventions applicable to the people's really daily lives and acceptable. You could come up with books and books full of all these recipes and algorithms and techniques, but if they don't accept it because it doesn't relate to their either belief system or their day-to-day challenges, then it's not going to go anywhere. So we hope, and it's an ongoing process, community-based participatory research is a ongoing process of give and take where we learn more and more by partnering with our partners in the community. So it's imperfect, but it's a process. And it's very important to do that. It's a lot of wasted grant money if you just try to burst into the community with something you tested in a very different population. There's no promises. All bets are off when you do that. So we are compelled to do that as a first step. Thanks for bringing it up. Thank you. Okay.
I,
Okay. Adrenaline, also called epinephrine, produced from the sympathetic nervous system when you are anxious. Fight or flight is what people refer to it as. There are receptors in cancer cells and immune cells called beta adrenergic receptors on the surface that when the epinephrine sits on that receptor, it sets in motion something called cyclic AMP and all kinds of nucleus changes that shut down the ability of the immune cell to clone, to make copies of itself so it can fight a viral infection. It also amps up the inflammatory response. Why? Because of the saber-toothed tiger cartoon I showed you. When early humans were under the stress of physical stress and challenges, they produced adrenaline to be able to run fast, fight well, and heal wounds and bacterial infections well. So when your boss presents something unreasonable to you or your partner, that same physiologic stress reaction happens, and you're not healing wounds. You're not running away from a saber-toothed tiger, but you have the same prehistoric reaction. And unfortunately, it favors a part of the immune system that is not that useful for cancer in the long term. Cancer is called the wound that never heals. So is cardiovascular lesions in the lumen of the arteries. If your body continues to make an inflammatory response to try to heal the unhealable wound, it causes inflammatory changes around the cells that can then allow them to get into the bloodstream, metastasize over time. So that's the angle. That's the biobehavioral model of what adrenaline does, how it does it at the site of the receptor of the cells, what happens on the tail end of the cells after they've been hit with adrenaline. It generally sends the immune system into the wrong direction, more toward inflammation, less toward helping with viral infections and helping long-term recovery from and management of the cancer. That's probably a reasonable way to a cartoon for that. Yes. Okay, thanks. Lunchtime.
I only wish we had another half hour or hour to listen to Dr. Antoni. It was just incredible. So lunch is I now set up, but before we go to lunch, it's Joy time. Joy, are you ready? I mentioned 10 shawls before. I think she has them. They're beautiful. And we're going to pass out what basically are raffle holders, whatever they are, for any survivors in the audience. You just raise your hand, And there are probably more than we have fans, but let's see what we get. And then Joy's going to bring over a bowl, and we're going to pick winners. I'm not in charge of passing those out, but you're going to really rely on me to pick out. You know what I did the last time? Okay. Okay. You pick it, I'll read it. That's only fair.